I'm going to give 5 lectures about Hegel, mostly about his central work, The Science of Logic. 2 lectures now in December and 3 in January. And today I'll start slowly working my way into Hegel and beginning with his immediate predecessors, notably with Kant. So, but first some remarks on Hegel's life, some preliminary remarks. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born in Stuttgart in Württemberg, the state of Württemberg in southwestern Germany, on the 27th August of 1770. So this year we had his 250th anniversary birthday. After attending the Stuttgart Gymnasium, that is a kind of high school with focus on classical languages, he studied theology at the nearby University of Tübingen. And actually today I am sitting here in Tübingen, so that's the place where Hegel studied. And he was a scholarship holder of the Protestant seminary there at the Tübinger Stift from 1788. After the obligatory basic studies of philosophy with a magister's degree 2 years later in 1790, he studied theology for 3 years until his church examination in 1793, again in Stuttgart then. He had to go to Stuttgart for the church examination. But then he did not become pastor or theologian here in Württemberg, but a private tutor first in Bern, in Switzerland, and then in Frankfurt, Germany, in central Germany, Frankfurt am Main. In 1801, he became a private lecturer. So he was a tutor in Bern and Frankfurt, and then he became a private lecturer at the University of Jena, and there he stayed until 1807, when he became an editor-in-chief of a journal in Bamberg, in Bavaria. So he moved around a lot in southern and central Germany. In 1808, he was professor and rector at the Gymnasium in Nuremberg, again in Bavaria, and finally they made him a professor of philosophy, namely in Heidelberg. In 1816, where he stayed until 1818, and then he got a vocation to Berlin and went to Berlin in 1818, where he taught until his death, and he died on the 14th of November in 1831. Well, that is all that I want to say about his biography. Reference books and biographies give the relevant information about the details of his life. But you see that professors in Germany then used to move around from one university to the next one. In Germany, there was no capital like Paris in France or London in England. So the academic population was always on the move. Here in these lectures, Hegel's mature philosophizing is to be dealt with, the early form of which became visible for the first time in the Phänomenologie des Geistes, the Phenomenology of Spirit, published in 1807 in Jena and Bamberg, and I'm going to call it Phenomenology for short henceforth. The Phenomenology was then followed in the Nuremberg years. So he was a gymnasium teacher then in Nuremberg, and yet he found the time to write his major work in these years, then The Science of Logic, in 2 parts and at the same time 3 books. So the Doctrine of Being was published in 1812, and the Doctrine of Essence in 1813. These are the first part, the objective logic. And then the Doctrine of the Concept was published in 1816 as the second part, the subjective logic. So there is this split between objective and subjective logic, which is an important thing to be aware of. The Doctrine of Being was published in a revised version posthumously in a second edition in 1832. Hegel did not have the time to revise the doctrine of essence and the doctrine of the concept. He died first. However, he published the whole of his logic in short form as the first of 3 parts of what he called the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in basic outline, in short, the Encyclopedia. So when he was made professor in Heidelberg, he needed a textbook for his students. And he wrote this textbook in an outline on his whole philosophical system, the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in basic outline for the listeners of his lectures. The encyclopedia contains in broad outlines Hegel's complete philosophical system, which has 3 parts. First, the logic, and then in the second and third parts of that book, the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit, which are somewhat misleadingly called Hegel's Realphilosophie, philosophy of the real. Misleadingly, because the logic already investigates the real, after all. The logic investigates the real in its own way, in its purely logical way. So the Realphilosophie just adds the introduction of space and time. That's what is new in the Realphilosophie. The logic abstraction is made from space and time. In 1827 and 1830, he published the Encyclopedia in extended second and third editions respectively in Berlin. So this is the Berlin Encyclopedia. The early one is the Heidelberg Encyclopedia. The encyclopedic logic, or small logic, in the third edition of 1830 is thus Hegel's last published word on the doctrine of essence and the doctrine of the concept. Finally, there's one more book to be mentioned, Hegel's Philosophy of Right. It's called Grundlinien der Philosophie des Rechts oder Naturrecht und Staatswissenschaft im Grundrisse. That is, ground lines, basic lines of the philosophy of right, or natural law, natural right, and science of the state in basic outline. Published in Berlin in 1821. Those Grundlinien contain a part of Hegel's philosophy of spirit. The philosophy of spirit, like everything in Hegel, has 3 parts. Subjective spirit, that is the theory of the individual human subjective spirit. Then objective spirit, that's the philosophical theory of the human institutions, like law, for example, morality. And then absolute spirit, the theory of the cultural achievements of art, religion, and philosophy of the sciences. So the middle part is objective spirit. And this is the topic of the Grundlinien, or the Rechtsphilosophie, philosophy of right. So, and there, the objective spirit is treated in more detail than an encyclopedia, but again, only an outline and as a guide for the listeners of the lectures. So Hegel always wrote books for the listeners of his lectures. Only the Science of Logic is written as a general book to the general audience. These are all the books belonging to the system of philosophy, the publication of which was arranged by Hegel himself. Several of his lectures on the philosophy of history, the philosophy of religion, aesthetics, history of philosophy, were edited posthumously by friends and students. Okay, so much for his books. In the following, Hegel's philosophical system will be explored from its logical basis, the science of logic. The second edition of 1832 is decisive for the doctrine of being, the last word on the doctrine of being. And with regard to the doctrines of essence and the concept, the later summaries in the Berlin Encyclopedia of 1830 are to be considered in addition to the early versions of 1813 and 1816. However, we shall first look at some aspects of the path from Kant to Hegel before dealing in detail with the science of logic in later lectures, and then taking a brief look at the entire system in the final lecture in January. So today I'm going to start with the time before Hegel, with section 1, the 25 years of philosophy. The 25 years of philosophy, that's a funny title. It's the title of a book that Eckhart Förster wrote. Eckhart Förster wrote a book with that title, The 25 Years of Philosophy, and that refers to the 25 years between the publication of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 1781 and the completion of Hegel's manuscript of the Phenomenology of Spirit in 1806. During that period, of course, not philosophy in general, but only classical German philosophy in particular, gained its definite shape. That is, its competing forms, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. Then in the following 25 years, until Hegel's death in 1831, it had its Hegelian continuation and elaboration. The fact that there are other continuations, a short and intensive one by Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who died in 1814, and a long one by Friedrich Wilhelm Schelling, who died only in 1854. He grew much older than Hegel did, should not be underestimated, though. Nor should the work of Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, who died in 1819, be underestimated. Jacobi had brought Spinoza's philosophy into the discussion as an alternative to Kant's philosophy in 1785, and later influenced the theory formation of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel as a critic, an initiator, and a keyword giver. So now, section 1.1, Kant's critique of pure reason. It all starts with Kant and with his critique of pure reason. And Kant opened this critique with a short transcendental aesthetic, followed by a long transcendental logic. Transcendental aesthetic, transcendental logic. The aesthetic is small, the logic is long. In the transcendental aesthetic, shape, space and time are treated as the general and pure, that is, as Kant says, completely non-empirically known forms of our sensuous intuition, and at the same time as the general forms of the extralogical manifold. Space and time, Kant says, are known a priori, completely in a completely non-empirical way by us. And at the same time, they are the general forms of the extralogical manifold surrounding us. In transcendental logic, then, the pure concepts of the understanding and associated pure judgments, as well as the pure concepts of reason, called ideas, and associated purely rational inferences, fallacies, purely rational fallacies, antinomies, paralogisms, are treated. So Kant has the idea that there are certain concepts, judgments, inferences that are pure, completely non-empirical, and nevertheless, reason can, in its purely rational inferences, make mistakes. There's transcendental illusion there to be detected. Okay, so but what does transcendental mean? A funny word, transcendental. What is transcendental philosophy? Well, it all started in the Middle Ages. The medieval scholastic philosophers regarded as transcendental the doctrine of the highest transgeneric and thus also transcategorial generalities. In the Middle Ages, in the Aristotelian scholastic philosophy, we had metaphysics. Metaphysics dealt with being as being and with categories of being. But then there were some very general concepts, still more general than the categories, and they were called transcendentals. Kant refers to the scholastics as die Alten, the ancients, the old ones, and quotes their mnemonic, quod libet ens est unum verum bonum. That is, any entity is one, unum, is true or real, verum, and good, bonum. The scholastic transcendental philosophy thus was but a short appendix to their metaphysics in general. It wasn't very interesting, it was very short. In contrast, the modern pre-Kantian philosophers in Germany, such as Christian Wolff and Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten, had a broader, much more comprehensive view of transcendental philosophy. They took it to be metaphysics as such. That is the epistemically pure, non-empirical, but nevertheless categorimatic theory of things, in contrast to logic and mathematics, which are both pure, non-empirical, but syn-categorimatic in their different ways. Let me explain this difference between categorimatic and syn-categorimatic. It goes back to William of Ockham. Terms, that is, expressions that can be predicated of things, like, for example, the categories, but also common names, dog and cat, adjectives, wise, and rational, whatever, and verbs like goes, sits, and so on are categorimatic. Logical particles, on the other hand, like or, and, if, then, and so on, are only syn-categorimatic expressions. Syn, they have a meaning together with the others, with the categorimatic ones. They do not stand for objects, and they are not true of anything. Kant calls what they express the functions of the understanding. So what the little particle or expresses is a function of the understanding. It doesn't refer to an object in the world, or just expresses an act of my understanding. I can form disjunctive judgments, either this or that. So the or stands for this action or this act of the understanding, the function of the understanding. It's syn-categorimatic, the or. Hence, in this sense, general logic or formal logic is the doctrine of certain syn-categorimatic aspects of thinking. Of course, one may deny that mathematics as well tends to this side. Plato, Frege, and Quine would definitely do so, and would insist that mathematical terms are categorimatic after all. Aristotle, Wittgenstein, and Wilfrid Sellers, on the other hand, tend to believe that mathematics is, in the last analysis, a science of the syn-categorimatic. But let us skip this topic and go back to transcendental philosophy and to Kant, who associates mathematics with the pure forms of sensibility, thus with pure intuition, not with logic. Although Kant adheres to the modern double definition of transcendental as pure and categorimatic, he concludes, in contrast to his rationalist predecessors, that a pure and categorimatic, that is, transcendental philosophy, cannot be the science of objects, cannot be metaphysics, neither general nor special metaphysics, that is, neither ontology nor rational psychology, cosmology, or theology. It is rather the doctrine of the pure categorimatic features of our cognition of objects. So next to pure and categorimatic, epistemic is thus the third characteristic of the transcendental for Kant. For Kant, transcendental philosophy then turns out to be the doctrine of the pure and categorimatic features of the a priori ways in which objects can be known by us. So the objects present themselves to us in certain a priori ways, in categorimatic ways. Transcendental aesthetics traces the epistemic basis of mathematics back to the pure forms of sensible intuition, sinnliche Anschauung, space and time. The main branch of transcendental philosophy, however, is transcendental logic. It is the objective branch of logic, what Hegel calls objective logic. That is the logic of the categorimatic logical form in which objects are present to our knowledge. So therefore, objective logic, the way that objects present themselves to us according to logic. Traits of objects that are categorimatic and at the same time purely logical are called categories by Kant. Categories, according to this terminology, are then categorimatic logical terms. General logic or formal logic, on the other hand, is what Hegel would call subjective logic. This is not to say that it is valid only subjectively or privately, but that it is valid for thinking activity of all rational subjects. All rational subjects think according to general logic. It is the doctrine of the logical form as the form of thinking as such, thus as a syn-categorimatic propositional form, while the objective logical form of things is categorical form. Propositional form, categorical form. Propositional form, the form of our judgments and sentences and statements of our thinking, and categorical form, the logical form of things out in the world, or the logical form under which things are present to us in the world. Kant makes use of this duality of logical form as categorical and as propositional when he uses the latter, the propositional form, as an undisputed guideline for the derivation of the former, the categorical form. So Kant has this idea in his so-called metaphysical deduction of the categories. Let us start with something undisputed, namely syllogistics. Syllogistics was a mature science ever since Aristotle, undisputed. The doctrine of syllogistic inferences, and has remained so until today, even if it can now be embedded in our modern predicate logic oriented on Frege. In light of this, Kant first argues briefly from the bottom up. Concepts are predicates for possible judgments, and judgments are premises and conclusions for possible syllogisms. And then he argues in detail, top down. He starts with the inferences, with the syllogistic side. There are categorical, now with a C, categorical, not categorial, categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive syllogisms. 3 types of syllogisms. This is undisputed ever since Aristotle. This concerns the relationship between the poles of the major premise in a syllogism. These poles are either related as subject and predicate. So such a premise of a syllogism could have the form S is P, subject is predicate. All humans are mortal, something like that. That would be a categorical judgment. Or the poles of the premise are related as antecedent and consequent. If P, then Q. Or thirdly, as subject and a disjunction of predicates. So S is P0 or P1 or and so on, Pn minus 1. So we have 3 types of relationships within judgments, within the major premises of syllogisms. All such judgments, that is, all propositions suitable for syllogisms, suitable for major premises of syllogisms, are either categorical or hypothetical or disjunctive. And this statement, by the way, is an example of a disjunctive statement. That's an example of a disjunctive statement if I say all judgments are either categorical or hypothetical or disjunctive. Secondly, judgments in syllogisms are made in different modes of validity. Premises are asserted in the assertoric mode. Just say P or S is P. Conclusions are demonstrated, given the premises, in the apodictic mode. They are shown to be true, given the premises. And antecedents of hypothetical judgments are only considered in the problematic mode, which then carries over to the consequence. If I say, if P, then Q, I don't assert P, and I don't assert Q. I just consider P as a possibility and say, if P, then Q. I just assert this combination, the if-then nexus. Okay, so then thirdly, the logical subject of a categorical judgment has a certain quantity. It is universal, particular, or singular. All humans are mortal, universal. Some humans are wise, particular. Socrates is wise, singular. And fourthly, the predicate together with the copula has a certain quality. It is either positive or negative or indefinite or infinite, as Kant says. So this person is loyal, that is positive. It is not the case that this person is loyal, that would be negative. That person is disloyal, that would be indefinite. Okay, so now we have a complete table of 4 times 3 logical acts or functions, as Kant says, of the understanding in judgments. Remarkably, Hegel feels bound to this table in his subjective logic. Remarkably, because normally he doesn't like quadruple forms. This table of judgments, this Kantian table, disturbs the triple classifications otherwise cultivated by Hegel. And still he clings to it. So Hegel thinks that Kant has a point here, that Kant is right in this table of forms of judgment. So much for propositional logical form, the basis of general or subjective logic. So this is the basis of syllogistics, of subjective formal logic. Kant derived categorial logical form, categorial without C now, that is the basis of transcendental or objective logic from it. The syncategorematic acts of thought and judgments correspond one to one, to categorematic logical contents. The categories of pure concepts, the categories or pure concepts of the understanding. For example, the if-then nexus of the hypothetical judgment gives the idea of, well, how to call it, iffiness or if-thenness, if-thenness. And this idea of if-thenness over their nature, that's the idea of causality. That is the category of causality that can be derived from the if-then combination in judgments, and so on for the other categories. Since the categories are not only necessarily and validly shaping our thinking, but are also meant to apply as terms to objects, the claimed objective validity still must be proven by Kant. And Kant undertakes this in his famous, or should I say infamous, transcendental deduction. So in the transcendental deduction tries to show that the categories are objectively valid of objects. To call Hegel's logic transcendental would be misleading, to say the least. For, firstly, it also is an heir to general logic. And secondly, it does not abstract from the real as such, as Kant's transcendental logic does, but only from the spatio-temporal form of what is real. Hegel's problem is not how thinking and being come together, but how they come apart in the first place. His logic is therefore transcendental at best in a pre-Kantian, non-epistemological sense. In Hegel, the categorical form precedes the predicative and propositional form. The objective logic as standard with reality, the objective logic as saturated with reality precedes the subjective logic. And if it does so, then it does so rightly. Hegel does not need a separate transcendental deduction of the pure categorematic contents, the categories. The pure contents of the categories of quality and quantity are treated by him in the logic of being, and those of modality and relation in the logic of essence. Only then does the logic of the concept follow as the subjective logic. However, what Hegel offers is anything but a mere regrouping of traditional materials. The categorematic contents of objective logic are not categories in the narrow sense. That is, no predicates, no unsaturated terms, to speak with Frege, which require logical subjects, names, to complete them. Predicates in general, and Aristotelian Kantian categories in particular, are incomplete thought contents and considered in isolation neither true nor false. Substance, or is a substance, for example, is neither true nor false. But the judgment, Socrates is a substance, is true or false. The various categorical contents of Hegel's logic, on the other hand, are self-contained thought contents, like judgments, as candidates for truth, even if not yet proposition-like or predication-like. More on this in due course. And Hegel's subjective logic by no means only botanizes our judgments and syllogisms. It does not botanize at all. Botanize like in biology, a scientist of flowers and plants botanizes the plants, just looks at them one by one. That is botanizing. Hegel's logic does not botanize. And as can be seen from its division into the three sections of subjectivity, objectivity, and idea, the subjective logic contains a surprising regression into the sphere of objectivity, right in its middle, and thus back again into the logical neighborhood of the objective logic. So Hegel's subjective logic is not syllogistics, it's something else. Finally, as far as Kant's transcendental aesthetic is concerned, it takes its place in Hegel's work, albeit not under its Kantian name and not as an unchanged doctrine, as an immediate follow-up of the logic. Space and time as the general forms of the extralogical multiplicity of real things are, in other words, the first topics of Hegel's philosophy of nature. Only then does the realm of individual logical subjects and general predicates, and thus the realm of real judgments and syllogisms, open up for Hegel. His logic portrays a qualitative logical space in a qualitative logical succession or logical time, if you want. It is only with the extralogical multiplicity in a quantitative physical space-time continuum that the so-called concepts, judgments, and syllogisms, which are in fact purely logical, as they are treated in Hegel's logic, become what we usually understand by concepts, judgments, and syllogisms, and what Hegel somewhat pejoratively calls mere representations, Vorstellungen, not Gedanken, not thoughts. We'll have to come back to this later. Now, I get to the next section after Kant. Logic and mathematics have been textbook sciences, that is, mature sciences in Thomas Kuhn's famous sense, capable of paradigms and of paradigm change and paradigm shift from time immemorial. And physics had been a mature science since its modern conversion to mathematical formulation and experimental verification by Galileo Galilei, Johannes Kepler, and then Isaac Newton. The successful coupling of physics and mathematics, however, had the consequence that metaphysics was suddenly discredited, stood alone, was left over. Physics had married mathematics, and now metaphysics was a single and disregarded. And this then led to ever new attempts to elevate metaphysics somehow to the rank of a mature science as well. Kant looked back on a series of unsuccessful attempts of this kind in Descartes and Locke and Hume, without realizing that a substantive doctrine can only become a mature science through mathematization plus appeal to experiments, which was not an option, though, for metaphysics. That is, for the first of all sciences. Metaphysics can't be subjected to mathematics because metaphysics is supposed to be prima philosophia, the first science. Thus, Kant's revolutionary intertwining of philosophy with logic in the transcendental logic undoubtedly produced a wealth of new insights, but not this one particularly sought after result. So science was not converted into, philosophy was not converted into mature science. Rather, the philosophical controversy continued as before, and will continue to do so in the future. For philosophy cannot, in principle, be transformed into an aperspectival mathematical science. But it is, as Heidegger first brought to general awareness, an essentially perspective-bound hermeneutic discipline, such as the theories of law, history, art, and literature, But unlike all these, philosophy is the first and basic hermeneutic science a priori. This remained hidden from Kant and his time. Thus, Karl Leonhard Reinhold in Jena attempted to rescue Kant's teachings from the ongoing controversy by deriving them from a new theory of human representation, which for its part was to be based on an undeniable grounding fact, the fact of consciousness, which Reinhold regarded as a foundation immune to skepticism. He formulated his so-called theorem or axiom of consciousness Satz des Bewusstseins, designed to express this basic fact in several variants. For example, in the following, I quote, "By no syllogism of reason, but by mere reflection on the fact of consciousness, we know that in consciousness, the representation, Vorstellung, is distinguished by the subject from the object and the subject and related to both. So we have consciousness, and within consciousness, the subject makes a distinction. It says, oh, there's the object, there's the representation, my representation, and there's the object, and here am I. Representation, object, subject, there's a relation between all three. This is the basic fact of consciousness, Reinhold says. But skepticism could not be silenced this way either. In particular, it was unclear how a whole philosophy could be spun out of the unique theorem or axiom of consciousness. Certainly not by simple logical deductions. You can't deduce much from a single sentence. But at best, as some people realized, by a logical archaeology of a very special kind, the kind that Kant had already envisaged, namely the targeted exploration of the conditions of the possibility of a given fact. In this case, of the fact of consciousness. We can ask for the conditions of the possibility of consciousness. And this, by the way, is how we obtain the fourth and today most prominent characteristic of the transcendental. Transcendental teachings and arguments are first pure, second categorematic, third epistemological, and fourthly archaeological in the outlined sense. However, only the first two features belong in the classical definition of the transcendental, the last two being Kantian corollaries. Hegel later modified the theorem of consciousness into the methodological principle of the phenomenology of spirit. But on the way to Hegel, there are still some intermediate stops to mention before. Particularly noteworthy is the revived interest in classical Pyrrhonian skepticism in the wake of Reinhold's anti-skeptical attempts at foundation. Skepticism struck back against Reinhold under the guidance of the Göttingen professor Gottlob Ernst Schulze, who in 1792 published his book Idealismus, that's the name of a classical ancient skeptic, or on the foundations of the elementary philosophy delivered by Professor Reinhold in Jena, along with the defense of skepticism against the presumptions of the criticism of reason. Schulze was a skeptic, a critic of Kant and Reinhold. In this state of debate, it soon became part of the aspiration of sophisticated philosophy, and it was indeed part of Hegel's ambition, to take the skeptic into account in the formation of theory. The skeptics who make it their business to prove the contradictory antithesis of any given proposition, and who, for their part, do no longer want to say what is the case, but only what seems to them to be the case. However, one can certainly anticipate that taking along of skeptics into the boat of theory building has to lead to the brink of philosophical shipwreck. And so it did in Fichte and Hegel. Philosophizing in the shadow of skepticism or in the face of contradiction is one of three innovations that Hegel could learn from Fichte. The other two fit the keywords fit under the keywords intertwining of categories and non-well-foundedness. This can be briefly explained by means of the three principles or axioms with which Fichte opened the foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre, Grundlage der gesamten Wissenschaftslehre or Doctrine of Science in 1794. The first absolutely unconditional principle or Grundsatz states at section 1 in Fichte, I quote, the I, the self, the I originally posits its own being, and since the positing I is the quintessence of all real determinations, this encompassing I provides the category of reality that belongs in the Kantian rubric of the three categories of quality, together with negation and limitation. According to the second principle, which is unconditional in terms of form, in terms of operation, negation, but conditional in terms of content, reads, to the I, a non-I is counterposited in an absolute way. From this second principle, Fichte gains the category of negation. That's section 2. The doctrine of science thus begins in an inconsistency, since the I, as the quintessence of the real, all reality, is contradictorily opposed to something else, a non-I. How could that be possible then? The third principle, the third Grundsatz, which is unconditional in terms of content, there's the I, there's the non-I, this content is given, which is unconditional in terms of content. It has to introduce a new primitive content, but conditioned in the terms of form, namely positing, counterpositing, has the task of eliminating the inconsistency. It reads, I counterposit in the I to the divisible I, a divisible non-I, which provides the category of determination or limitation. Without going into details, it should only be noted that this third principle only provisionally resolves the contradiction between the first two, so that Fichte has to stage a very special archaeological excavation art and a continued logical disaster management. And in doing so, has to find ever new theorems that suspend contradictions, thus being able to derive further categories. At the end, that is at the fixed point of the doctrine of science, the self-positing of the I reveals itself to have been a positing of an infinite ought or an obligation. That's Kant's categorical imperative, which on the one hand has always already been accomplished because the ought is in force as a demand of reason. But on the other hand, still has to be accomplished, is still open to be accomplished because the ought is not an is. What you ought to do is not yet done. Hegel will criticize this proposal to resolve the initial contradiction as, on the contrary, a way of perpetuating it. There's always this demand of reason and it's not yet accomplished. But Fichte's method of logical disaster management by means of logical archaeology, which exposes the categories in a systematic order, will be adopted by Hegel in the science of logic. Inconsistency must not be suppressed, he believes, but must be faced. You have to look the contradiction into the face. Of course, the contradiction cannot be true. So what it expresses cannot remain as stated, but therein lies its theoretical blessing. Inconsistency compels us to go further, to move ahead, It forces us to constantly uncover new conceptual structures, new categories, which thereby prove to be intertwined in an internal logical order and succession, whereas in Kant's work, they were only taken one by one from the acts of thinking and judgments. So much for inconsistency, the category intertwining. So much for both of that, inconsistency and category intertwining. What remains to be addressed is non-well-foundedness. This term, which Fichte and Hegel do not use, comes from set theory that was created only later by Georg Cantor in the 19th century. Sets are called non-well-founded when they themselves occur in their own epsilon descendancy, that is, among their own members, or among members of their own members. The simplest case of a non-well-founded set is the unit set of itself. The unit set of itself, or the singleton of itself, which is called omega. I see that it is called A in the slide that you're looking at. So let us call it A. For which the following identities hold. The identities are there to be looked at. A is identical to the unit set of A, and identical to the unit set of the unit set of A, and identical to the unit set of the unit set of the unit set of A, and identical, and so on, till in the end, we have just an infinite series of those brackets for set formation, and nothing in the middle, no A there in the middle, just dots for repeating the brackets over and over again. So there is a hollow core. There is nothing to start with here in this non-well-founded set. If one wanted to understand the operation of set formation, or unit set formation for that matter, as a concrete construction, the idea of omega, or A, would amount to the idea of an impossible circularly constituted object. But mathematical objects are abstractions. And for the set omega and its ilk, it can be proved that we can accept them without inconsistency, provided that the usual axiomatization of set theory is consistent. Of course, the foundation axiom must then be replaced by a suitable anti-foundation axiom. The phrase unit set of itself shows how Fichte and Hegel would put cases of non-well-foundedness into language, namely as self-relationships. Thus, Fichte speaks of the self-positing I, Hegel of the other of itself, of the difference related as difference to itself, of the self-relationship of the negative, and so on and so on. Positing, or to posit, in German, setzen, to set, literally in English. In Latin, ponere is a logical working concept, whose logical counter-concept would perhaps be expressed as depositing, but depositing already has something, means something different, has a different meaning. And therefore we should better say, better use the artificial term of art, sublate or sublating, for the counteract of positing. Positing and sublating in German, setzen, aufheben. In Latin, ponere, tollere. Confer modus ponens and modus tollens in syllogistics. Whatever posits itself or sets itself, sich selbst setzt in German, sets itself into force, gives itself validity or authority, such as, according to Fichte, the absolute I or reason posits itself, gives itself authority. But how could something give itself validity that was not already valid, that is, authorized to do so? It's a miracle. Fichte already had this problem in mind early on in his 1794 review of Schulze's Idealismus, when he defended Reinhold against the criticism of the skeptic, that is, against Schulze. I quote, who now, as soon as the word representation hits his ear, can think of nothing else but some round or square thing that exists independently of its representing, that is, as a thing in itself, more precisely as a representing thing, res cogitans. The power of representation exists for the power of representation and through or by the power of representation. This is the necessary circle in which every finite understanding, that is, every understanding conceivable to us, is enclosed. Whoever wants to go beyond this circle do not understand themselves and do not know what they want. End of quote. That was Fichte. There's this circle of representation, or the circle of the self-positing I. The circle of the power of representation of the I is therefore not vicious, Fichte says, but rather provides Fichte's philosophical basic point and punchline. The fact that we must and may acknowledge it was most likely his original insight, his starting insight in philosophy. There is this circle of consciousness, the circle of the I. The I is nothing in itself. Everything that the I is posited by the I itself. The I posits itself, gives itself validity or authority. Reason, it gives itself its rational authority. There is nothing external to it. However, what exists only for itself and not independently of its representational activity, that is not also in itself, exists, strictly speaking, only as something that is at the same time sublated. It's not in itself, it's sublated, and more precisely, it is self-sublating, and thus only something ideal, not real, not in itself. In terms of Jean-Paul Sartre's pointed distinction between the in itself and the for itself, one could say, what originally posits itself and thus gives itself being for itself, ipso facto sublates itself qua something which was in itself, and now it sublates itself into something which is only for itself. And it annihilates itself. So the self-positing is at the same time a self-annihilation, self-sublating. It turns itself into a void, de-ontologized quasi-causa sui. In the limiting case, therefore, the case of non-well-foundedness, or circular self-relatedness, positing and sublating, setzen and aufheben, converge. Self-positing and self-sublating come to one and end up in a void being for itself. Fichte, of course, did not mean the absolute I in this way, but rather on the contrary, as the quintessence of all real determinations, as all reality. But this is how he was read, notably by Jacobi, who denounced Fichte's doctrine of science as nihilistic, along such lines. Schelling and Hegel, with a similar tendency, attested at an empty, purely subjective idealism. In 1800, Fichte reacted to the accusation of nihilism or subjectivism in his booklet, The Vocation of Man, die Bestimmung des Menschen. In later lectures on the doctrine of science, he defended himself against this charge on strong philosophical grounds. In his later works, he conceived the absolute I as a completely transparent thing. The I is completely transparent. It's the unveiled image of the absolute, an image that does not reflect itself emptily within itself, but points out of itself and beyond itself into the truly real, that is the absolute. But Fichte's various versions of the doctrine of science are not our concern. Hegel was probably unable and unwilling to take note of them either. Fichte didn't publish them, he just gave lectures on them later. Through his close collaboration with Schelling in Jena, Hegel was strengthened in a position that fits under the label of objective idealism. According to this position, subject and object, thinking and being are logically entangled up or intertwined to the point of identity, be it a tension-filled, this dialectic one, as in Hegel, or an indifferent one, as in Schelling. And by no means one can be reduced to the other, neither thinking to being, as materialism teaches, nor being to thinking, as subject idealism teaches. As we shall see, Hegel remained steadfastly true to this position later on. But this is then a topic for the lectures to come. I thank you so much for today. Thank you for listening.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay. You can hear me now. Or?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. I mean, just there are some people. So between 300 or 400 people have heard your lecture, and it's very
so many people.
300
okay.
or 400. Okay. Yeah, thank you for your wonderful presentation. And we have also invited Professor Zhouhuang from Beijing Normal University as a commentator on your talk. She's also she's specified in Kant, especially Kant's third critique. And so let us welcome Professor Zhou.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah. Glad that you are there.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your illustrative presentation. And let me at first summarize a little your lecture for the publicum.
Okay.
And after a short introduction of Hegel's life and works, Professor Koch drew a picture of philosophical development in the 25 years, from 1781 to 1806, from Kant to Hegel, from Kant to Fichte towards Hegel. Professor Koch's summary of the four characteristics of the transcendental can be considered as the basic clue of his lecture. The four characteristics are pure, categoriamatic, epistematic, archaeologic. For the first two characteristics belong in the classic definition of the transcendental and are relatively clear. Professor Koch focused on the last two. In the first part of his lecture, he explained the epistemic characteristic with regard to Kantian construction of his transcendental logic and also Hegel's critique on it. In the second part of his lecture, Professor Koch illustrated the archaeological characteristic of the transcendental with Fichte's philosophy, especially in terms of his impacts on Hegel. These impacts are summarized as three keywords. The first one is philosophy in face of contradiction. The second is in winning of categories. And the third one is non-will foundedness. That is the short summary of Professor Koch's lecture. And I have 3 questions. The first question is more clarifying question. It is about understanding of Fichte's theory of self-construction. Professor Koch has raised the question himself also. How could the absolute I give itself the validity that was not already valid? Yeah, his answer to this question is the power of representation. The power of representation exists for itself and through itself. And could you please say more about this special kind of power of representation? What drives the power of representation in the self-positing and self-sublating process? And how does it get the normativity or the validity from itself? It is a very tricky feature of it. And I have the second question is a general one. I have the impression that Professor Koch illustrated Fichte's philosophy as a mediation between Kant and Hegel, mainly from the cognitive perspective, or generally Professor Koch's lecture on the philosophical development from Kant to Hegel is mainly from the cognitive perspective, but not so much from the practical perspective. I am not a Fichte specialist, but from my limited reading on Fichte, I would contribute the unity of cognitive and non-cognitive subjectivity, as well the unity of the theoretical I and practical I. I will attribute this unity to the basis of Fichte's theory of self-construction. The practical feature of subjectivity, which is manifested in his special terminology, Tathandlung or act, it seems to me makes the active, dynamic, and self-productive character of the subject possible. What do you say this practical dimension of Fichte's philosophy? So how could we understand the dynamic dynamic characteristic of Fichte's philosophy? I think maybe from only a cognitive perspective seems to me not so enough, so ausreichend. Also, my next question is an extended question. When we talk about the development from Kant to Hegel, we always emphasize that the Fichte and Hegel's critique of Kant, and we also consider Kant's philosophy as surpassed by Fichte and Hegel. However, maybe there is also a continuity between Kant, Fichte, and Hegel. Kant himself also developed a theory of an self-related or self-legislative application of the power of judgment. And he also talks a lot about on the topic of the transition from nature to freedom. And Hegel has also praised Kant's attempt in the history of philosophy on this point. So what would you say on Kant's attempt on this perspective? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for these questions. May I begin with the last one?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I like this question particularly. Personally, I am a Kantian.
Okay.
Died in the wool, not a Hegelian. I think Kant is right against Hegel. So I, of course, would say Kant was not surpassed by Fichte and Hegel. And Fichte wouldn't say so too. Fichte always, or very often claims that he is still basically a Kantian philosopher. He may be right, he may be wrong, but that's something different. But Fichte saw a continuity of Kant's thought and his own. Hegel, on the other hand, had this tendency, which I think is totally wrong. As an interpreter and a critic of Kant and Fichte, he goes awry, he goes wrong. He accuses them of subjective idealism. And I don't think that this accusation is right. Mm-hmm. So this is not a critique of Hegel's own philosophy, but it is a criticism of Hegel's relation to Kant. He underestimates Kantian philosophy, definitely, I would say. So Kant is not that kind of subjective idealist that Hegel thinks he is. So yes, and personally I think there's a totally different methodology operative in Kant on the one hand and Fichte on the other hand. Well, in the methodology, Fichte is in between, I would say. Kant, but you know that better than I do probably. Kant Kant tries to give what he calls deductions only. And this is a literary genre, a deduction in the Kantian sense, taken from the science of law in his days and from legal practice. So lawyers would give deductions at court. And there was a whole huge textbook literature on how deductions ought to be written to be effective. And Kant follows this pattern in his transcendental deduction of the categories. And the main point for Kant is that giving a deduction will free him of superfluous burdens of proof. It will lower the burdens of proof to him. So he need not say more than is necessary to make his point. At court, you should be short and just talk of things that are relevant for the issue. So if there's a quarrel between two parties, in Kant it's the rationalists and the empiricists, on the objective validity of the categories, you need not go back to the beginning in an absolute I. If you do that, you will have to shoulder a lot of burdens of proof, and you will write books that no one can understand. Kant would say, I think, that Fichte and Hegel, who wanted more than giving deductions, got lost in books that no reader can really understand. So to give a deduction is a more promising and a more down-to-earth project. And you don't need anything else. You need just this deduction, Kant would say. That's enough. So, okay, but maybe I should stop at this point. Then, well, the first question was relating to the circle of the I, the self-positing I, and the power of representation. Okay, power of representation is just Reinhold's term, and Fichte then alters that into the I. Reinhold talked of the power of representation, and Fichte later on said, okay, let's call that the I, this power of representation. And yeah, what about the self-validation? This is indeed something very astonishing. And this is why I appeal to non-well-founded sets. The unit set of itself, think of set formation. We form sets. So we need something, we need some members. I take this, well, this pencil and this glass, and then I form the set of them. It's the set of the pen and the glass, a set with two members. But if I don't have any members, I cannot create sets. That's the idea of the axiom of foundation in set theory. You first need the member, let's say the empty set, and then you can form a unit set of the empty set. But if you have nothing, you cannot form a set of it. The idea of non-well-founded sets, on the contrary, is the crazy, you would say, idea of just having the operation of set formation, and the operation all of its own delivers a set, the unit set of itself. This is this circularity. And in set theory, you can show that there is no inconsistency in this thought. And Fichte's idea, Fichte's original insight seems to have been that this is exactly what happens in self-consciousness, in the consciousness of the I. But it's not about set formation, it's just positing. The I is not something which can be created from the outside. It has, in a way, to validitate itself. Reason is not something that is done from non-reason, from the outside. Reason has to self-validitate itself and say, here I am, now I am there, I, reason, I, the absolute I. And that's my authority. It's a self-creating authority. And this relates to the second question that you asked, the practical perspective. In Kant, there is something like that as well. Fichte always said that. So Kant, as we all know, was not very fond of, to say the least, of the idea or of the concept of intellectual intuition. Kant said, okay, there's sensuous intuition, sensible intuition. That's our form of intuition through the senses. Intellectual intuition, that would be something else. That would be something of, well, God may have intellectual intuition. And this would be an intuition that in intuiting things, in a way, creates things. So intellectual intuition would be creative, productive. While our sensible intuition is always recessive, always passive. We have to receive information through the senses. Intellectual intuition would be active, create its own objects. And this is not our thing, Kant says. Fichte and Schelling, they stick to the term intellectual intuition. They use that term affirmatively. And Fichte says, well, this is not a deviation from Kant in substance, only in terminology, because Kant himself had this fact of intellectual intuition before his eyes in his practical philosophy, namely the moral law, the law of autonomy, the law of freedom, however you want to call it, the law of pure practical reason. The validity of this law is something that Kant could not deduce from anything else. And so in the second critique, he appealed to the one and only fact of reason, factum der Vernunft, the one and only fact of reason. That's the authority, that is the validity of the moral law, the purely rational law, the category imperative. Okay, so here Fichte would say we have in fact kind of intellectual intuition, although Kant doesn't call it like that. And this intellectual intuition is not an intuition of objects. Kant was right about that. We don't have an intellectual intuition of objects. But this is a kind of intellectual self-intuition. And it's eminently practical, as you said. It's this practical consciousness of an original validity of a law of reason, self-validating. There we have the circle again. And Fichte thought that we have to acknowledge this circularity, and that it is not vicious, or, well, it is vicious in the beginning. It leads to contradictions, but then you have to cope with this contradiction, these contradictions in theory building, in this archaeology. and try to mitigate the contradictions. And in the end, yeah, that's the result of his foundation of the doctrine of science. In the end, we see that the self-positing act of the I is an eminently practical act. It's what Kant called the fact of reason, Faktum der Vernunft. It's the creating the validity of the moral law, the ought, the unconditional ought, the categorical ought. And the validity of this categorical ought, this is, in fact, was what comes out of the self-positing I. And then the theoretical side, the cognitive side, theoretical philosophy is in a way, well, a follow-up of that. So for him, there is at the basis this unity of practice and theory, of cognition and of obligation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Koch and Professor Zhou. It is now the Q&A time. So we have a lot of time. We have so a half hour. So
oh yeah,
yeah, it's a good news. So so we will try to get all the questions, and maybe we can do this in this way. So teachers and students in the Zoom can ask some questions. Maybe 3 questions, and then Professor Koch will answer the question. And after that, people in Binibini can write down your questions. And our graduate student, Zhouhuang, will select 3 questions. And then Professor Koch will answer it. Okay, then.
Yeah, can you see me?
Fine.
Hey, guten Tag, Professor Koch.
Yeah, guten Tag.
Hey, thanks for your brilliant. Okay, so okay, thanks for your brilliant lecture. And recently, I am reading Dieter Heinrich's his Between Kant and Hegel. So my personal 2 questions were about Heinrich, this book, and later I will interpret the questions posted from the Bilibili Live, because the audiences are so enthusiastic about your lecture, and they post a lot, so many questions, and I will select some of them to interpret to you.
Okay.
And so, since I just read the question and interpret in such a short time, so if I made any mistakes, please, the audiences, so, and feel free to correct me. You can send a message to, through the Bilibili Live, and I will see it now. And first, it goes about my own questions. And while I'm reading Heinrich's Between Kant and Hegel, in the preface, the author, or not the author, the editor of this book, I remember it is his student Passini. I don't remember that. So he, in the preface, he wrote that at the very beginning of the publication of this book, Heinrich insisted that the title of this book should be modified to Between Kant and Hegel instead of the original From Kant to Hegel. And I've noticed that the title of your lecture is From Kant to Hegel. So I'm interested that are the view of From Kant and Hegel and the view of Between Kant and Hegel. What relationships are they in? Are they 2 totally different paradigms, research paradigms, or just different way to research into the German idealism? Are they complementary to each other or incommensurable? This is my first question.
Okay.
Yes. Later I will tell you my second question.
Okay, fine. Yeah, go on. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I would say if you talk about the time from Kant to Hegel, you include the end terms, Kant and Hegel. From Kant to Hegel, you begin with Kant and you end with Hegel. If you say between Kant and Hegel, this suggests that you're talking about what comes between them. So Fichte, Jacobi, Reinhold, Schelling.
Yeah, I understand this. But according to Heinrich, so the saying from Kant to Hegel may implies a linear development. I mean, this is read maybe from the view of history of philosophy from Hegel's standpoint, because he thinks that the philosophy of the history of philosophy is the development of maybe I don't know how he said it. So because there is a linear clue, so we can resort to the very beginning of the Greek philosophy, and then from Parmenides to Heraclitus, and then from these great thinkers to the then German idealism, and the final point is Hegel. So he thinks that there are some causal relations between them, but in Heinrich, his book, he treated that their relationships actually are much more complex than Hegel has seen. So I think the gist of my question lies within this domain. Okay. Can you understand me?
Yes, I think I got at least part of your concern.
I'm sorry for my lacking ability of English. So my main
never mind. It's not my native tongue anyway, so I don't speak that well.
Thank you.
Anyway, okay. Yeah, sure. Hegel has definite views about the history of philosophy and about a certain necessary succession, but this will be something I'm going to talk about indirectly when I talk about the logical evolution that is portrayed in the science of logic. So Hegel thinks that what goes on in the science of logic is a presentation of the certain forms of metaphysics that metaphysics took from the beginning with Parmenides until, well, Fichte, Schelling, and then Hegel himself in the end.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but yeah, this is Hegel's interpretation of what is going on in his own science of logic.
Yeah.
And he may be right in the science of logic and be wrong in his own self-portraying interpretation of what he is doing there. Okay. And so he has, of course, a certain picture of what was going on. And in the phenomenology, by the way, he says, now philosophy should become a science, not just a love of wisdom, philosophia, but wisdom, sophia. So finally, philosophy should become a science. And now everything is there, everything is ready. Kant and Fichte gave us all the necessary ingredients, and then Schelling and I, Schelling and Hegel, we here at Jena accomplished the real thing. And now for the first time in human history, philosophy as a science has shown up as a phenomenon. Philosophy qua science now is a real phenomenon that you can study. And now what is the next task for philosophers is to develop that systematically. So the phenomenology of spirit, in a way, gives then an idealized history of German consciousness from the beginnings in the caves 30,000 years back or so, to Kant and Fichte, and to then Schelling and Hegel. Schelling and Hegel were still a unity, a kind of team then in 1806. And now you have then this idealized story of the development. Yeah, this is Hegel's own story. We need not believe that. Maybe there's something to it, but okay, this is a topic for later lecture.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah. Okay.
And my second question is, in Heinrich's, it's still about Heinrich's, this book. And in this book, he described the German idealism as philosophy of mind. And why did he choose this mind instead of the common translation of the German Geist into spirit? Because mind is is a notion full of experience. We now have philosophy, but the philosophy of mind now is a sub-branch of the philosophy of science. And in the research paradigm now, we delve into the mind with the help of the development in technology. So in such a mode of speech, he chose this mind instead of spirit. This seems to me to be a little confusing.
Yes, you're right. So perhaps one could equate mind with subjective spirit in Hegel. So Hegel, in his philosophy of spirit, as I said, has three parts: subjective spirit, objective spirit, absolute spirit. Okay, so subjective spirit, that is the private personal spirit of a human being, that's the mind of that human being. That's subjective spirit. But objective spirit, that's not mind. That's intersubjectivity. This is, kind of externalism of the mental. So the mental that is there in our institutions, in our states, in our systems of morality, in our schools and kindergartens and so on. That's objective spirit. And absolute spirit, that's the fine, last cultural achievements of art, religion, and philosophy, science. So, Geist in English, literal translation would be ghost. Heiliger Geist, Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit. But of course, ghost is a bit ambiguous.
Now I will try.
Mind is just mens. The Latin mens is mind in English. In German, there's no word for that. No. Gemüt, says Kant. Gemüt, my mood. Mens, the mental, das Mentale. Or Bewusstsein, would say consciousness, Bewusstsein in Germany, but mind, we have no equivalent for that.
So his choice is, to me, is very confusing. I cannot understand what this philosophy of mind refers to. So I just delete it, and instead I write German idealism on it. So this will help me understand this book. But it is my own way. And now I will translate the questions from the Billy Leaf. And the first question is about Hegel's famous criticism to Kant. We know that Hegel thought that Kant he used a symphony to he described Kant as learn to swim on the bank, and Hegel think that we should go into the water and learn to swim within it. How should we understand this criticism? Is he right on this point?
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. I think that, Hegel is not a very sensitive interpreter of Kant, and he accuses Kant of theoretical flaws that Kant didn't commit. He thinks of Kant or of Kantians in the following way. So, critical philosophy. What is critical philosophy according to Hegel? Well, we had metaphysics before Kant, Christian Wolff, Baumgarten, and others. So Kant said, oh, before we do metaphysics, we first have to see if we can do metaphysics. So we have to critically investigate our own rational capacities first, and critical philosophy. And so this is a bit like learning to swim on the bank, having a textbook and then studying the movements you have to make and so on. But you won't learn to swim then. This critical philosophy itself has to be a kind of metaphysics already, Hegel would say. So there's not this division of something before you enter philosophy, you enter metaphysics, namely critical philosophy, and then doing philosophy is a bit like first learning to swim on the bank and then go swimming. That's a picture he had in mind. And sure, you have to do philosophy in order to learn philosophy. In this point, he's right, but Kant wouldn't have doubted that.
Yeah. Because if I want to defend this for Kant, I will reply to Hegel that it is true that we have to go into the river so that we can really learn to swim. But before going into it, we have to do some practice. We have to learn it from textbook, or if we just go into it, we will surely die. Yeah.
Okay.
This is my. Maybe it looks like a joke, but this is my reply. So I think Kant's work is this textbook. And the second, we still have some time. And the second question, it goes about the relationship between Hegel and Schelling. We know that in Hegel's early period, he agreed with Schelling's ideas about the absolute identity between the object and the subject. Later, he deviated from this standpoint because he think that he thought Schelling was wrong. But why did this happen?
Why did this happen? It's a good question. I think it happened when Schelling left Jena. He left before Hegel, and Hegel then was in Jena without Schelling. They couldn't discuss philosophy any longer. They could only correspond on it. And then Hegel, in a way, well, Hegel was the older, 5 years older than Schelling, but he was the pupil of Schelling. Schelling was faster than Hegel, more advanced. So he was already a famous professor at Jena when Hegel came there as a private lecturer. And Hegel, in a way, cooperated with him, and they had a common idea, namely the common idea that subjective idealism is wrong. And you have to see that there is a primitive identity of the object and the subject called the absolute, or the absolute subject-object, whatever. This is identity philosophy, Schelling. And then what happened is that Hegel realized that Schelling was thinking this identity in a static way, as an absolute indifference. There's just this starting point of indifference, and that's the absolute. The absolute then turns out to be the night in which all cows are black, as Hegel mockingly said in the preface to the Phenomenology. So Hegel stayed steadfastly with the idea of this subject-object identity, but he thought you have to think this identity in a dynamic, speculative, dialectical form. So it is an unstable, it is a moving kind of identity, something that sets a whole system of structured thought contents free out of itself. So I think this was the point where he finally emancipated himself from Schelling. He tried to do that in a friendly way first. He didn't mention Schelling and didn't criticize him in the phenomenology, but Schelling, of course, clever person, saw and realized that in fact he was attacked by Hegel then, and that was the end of their friendship. Sadly, they could have stayed friends nonetheless, of course. So that's the point. Hegel had the idea that this identity of subject and object ought to be conceived in a Heraclitean way, that is, as something full of tension and dynamics and dialectics, and not just indifference.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Koch. Thank you for the lecture. Thank you, everyone. Schönen Abend. Tschüss.
Danke ebenfalls.
Tschüss.
Tschüss.
Tschüss.